All right. Okay, let's get started and people can join us. As I said, thank you so much for joining us for our program this evening. It's going to be incredible. The program is brought to you by CMYK Council, which is a council comprised of BIPOC designers, artists, teachers, and Poster House staff. Today, it is my honor to welcome Brian Johnson to lead our program. Brian Johnson is a partner at Polymode Studio, where he focuses on creative direction, design production, writing, and teaching. Born into a family of printers, he is deeply invested in the production of good design without sacrificing our humanity or environment. He is a member of the Monacan Nation and holds a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, which is something that we have in common, we just found out. His most recent publication, Queering the Grid, Reading Codes in Dan Friedman's Teachings with Silas Munro, who is also present, and has led to his current design writing research on Friedman's 1994 Radical Manifesto, which will be approaching its 30-year anniversary. So without further ado, I present to you Brian Johnson with Posters That Sing, Notes on Indigenous Poster Design. Brian, take it away.
Certainly. Thank you to Maya and Salvador and to Poster House for having me back to speak again. This is my second time. I'm really honored and privileged to be here. So let's get started. Thanks everybody for coming.
Brian, 1 second, sorry, I totally forgot to mention that if anyone has any questions, to please put it into the chat or the Q&A offerings on Zoom, and I will relay the questions to you. Thank you.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. So let's jump right in. This is a poster that is directly addressing the viewer and asking to sort of like fill in the blank and to acknowledge that you are actually on someone's ancestral lands. So I want to start this evening by gratefully acknowledging the Munsee Lenape people whose ancestral homelands I am presenting from today here at Poster House in New York City. I would also like to acknowledge the Lumbees of North Carolina, where much of this research was done at my home in Raleigh. And finally, my own ancestral Monacan land in Central Virginia, where my grandparents and great-parents were kept. But since we're all gathered here today online, please feel free to drop into the chat where you're tuning in today from and who those original stewards were. I did see that we already have a Vancouver shot, which was amazing. So these land acknowledgements help reconnect and redirect the erasure that colonization has removed from the story of Indigenous people. And if for any reason you don't know, you can also check out nativeland.ca, type in where you are, and you can see where the different sort of overlappings are of who would actually be there. It was also just dropped in the chat for you. So let's just start with the title of why I named my presentation Posters That Sing. I know it's one of those like classic little things where you're just like, let's get a dictionary out, but it's literally to make the verb to make the musical sound with one's voice. But a voice could also be words, it could also be imagery or graphic representation. So I want to spend the next 45 minutes or so discussing how I conceptualize and categorize these notes within Indigenous poster design. I'll be showing a variety of posters in a quasi-linear fashion, and because storytelling for me is non-linear, but I'm also a dusty historian with nerdage. So it's like I am going to take you in sort of a very linear understanding of these things, but I'm also going to look at the call and response that has both melody and rejoinder over time. I see these posters as two distinct groups. There's celebration and there are those of protest, as you can see here. And within each, there are countless songs, melodies, and variations on a theme. So as we started with the land acknowledgement in honor of the physical earth and its stewards and caretakers, that honor comes from understanding the landscape as a knowable, living, understood space and geography. Maps are learning tools, registering typography, bodies of water, natural wonders, roads, city locations, habitation, and crop zones. Yet they also aid in the concept of colonialism, nationalism, exclusion, and ostracism. As we see here, the history of land encroachment and the reservation system enacted by the concept of manifest destiny and its Western expansion and its enabling laws mixed with countless broken treaties. So when you actually look at this work, you also see that it still sings. There's the geometric border. There's the concise organization of the typography. And it's like there's those striking use of colors and contrast by using the red, by using the black. And these difficult messages and stark realities can certainly say more and provide stable footing for processing the poster's content. I also want to give a general trigger warning. There are no violent or graphic images in my talk, but the deeper complexities and mistreatment, pain, and suffering of countless millions can actually be quite daunting. Even in talking and discussing and getting excited about the love that I have for design, the knowledge and the hardship of some of these pieces that it can actually express can be pretty difficult. And so I just want to acknowledge that not only for myself, but for anyone else who is sensitive. There's a joke within our entire group that I'm a sensitive boy. I tend to attract sensitive people. And so I could get very, very excited about saying, look how beautiful this is, but then it's also talking about genocide. So it also comes with these many paradoxes that I'll kind of show within these pieces. And so I'll point out some of those paradoxes, but you also might be able to find some on your own. One of the biggest to start here is the literal formality of coloniality made by laws and treaties, and then how they were broken whenever convenient, a constant practice that was enacted against Indigenous people on the North American continent by its unsettling with the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British colonizers. Here we have a sign posted by the Hopi Nation stating that their sovereignty was broken by visitors that came to the Hopi lands and took photographs. The caption below, it's really teeny, you can't see it, reads, "We are grateful to Henning Christoph, a German photographer, for this photograph of a sign outside in the Hopi Nation, one of the two oldest continually inhabited settlements in the North American continent. The village council posted this sign after tourists violated instructions that they were not to photograph the sacred Hopi dances." So a little personal history. As my chosen family knows and will never let me forget, I was born and grew up in Virginia. I take deep pride in grounding from that beautiful landscape, and it truly is a part of my spirit. This map for me shows and represents my personal past, my present, and my future. My own paradox, which is a dovetailing of paternal indigeneity and my maternal coloniality, are all both represented right here. This map was drawn by Captain John Smith and engraved by William Hull. It consists of a very accurate depiction of the mid-Atlantic coast at the beginning of the unsettling by the English. Here you can see the Chesapeake Bay, its surrounding rivers, along with indigenous villages and encampments. You can see that there's Jamestown. You might remember this is the first permanent British settlement that was made in the colony of Virginia. And you see over here on this corner, you have a representation of an Indigenous person. They're smiling, their hip is jauntily moved to the side. They're covered in some furs. But this is a watercolor that was done by John White, an artist and a cartographer who made a series of 70 watercolors and drawings of Indigenous peoples, plants, and animals during the first English visit to the New World. The purpose of his drawings was to give those back at home an accurate idea of the inhabitants and its environment. And then in 1590, Theodore de Brie made engravings from White's drawings and watercolors. So you then look at this and you say, all right, so they're a little more detailed, but there is a discrepancy here, right? So I kind of wonder, why is it that William Hull takes liberties to reconstruct this look of an Indigenous person on the right, here with, let's say, socially acceptable clothing or body coverings, based on the moral code of England at that time. So these liberties like this tend to whitewash and alter culture distinctions, which then lead to misrepresentations of significant armaments, adornments, jewelry, and tattooing. And thus we start to see the erasure of Indigenous peoples here 34 years between the making of this actual map and the engraving that's seen here. So Virginia's history of Indigenous oppression is a sad and large epic in and of itself. Our family knew of our Indigenous heritage, but it wasn't really spoken about due to the oppressive racial laws set in motion in post-Reconstruction, where no Indigenous person could self-identify as such on birth, death, or marriage certificates. They were instantly labeled colored or a Negro by the Commonwealth, or in common vernacular, almost white. And if the family was to marry and survive, the issue of being able to pass comes into play. Don't forget, an interracial marriage was still illegal in 16 states until Lovings versus Virginia in 1967. As a reconnecting Indigenous person, this is one of the first pieces where I saw a representation of the Monacans in a graphic historical context. After the establishment of Jamestown and its eventual ways of disease and warfare, the tribe pretty much disintegrated, as did its language base, which is a Siouan language system similar to Tutelo. The last fluent speaker of Tutelo died in 1871. There are about 2,300 so Monacans that still remain within Virginia and the United States and the world as of today. So one of the first printed pieces I found in support for Indigenous culture and sovereignty was this broadsheet containing the Cherokee alphabet. One way to safeguard against cultural erasure is to document the language. Sequoyah, a Cherokee polymath, created this Cherokee alphabet or syllabary in 1821. The chart here shows the letters of the Cherokee alphabet with italic lowercase Roman letters representing the sounds made by each beside the Cherokee letter form. Here at the bottom are explanations of how the sound actually works. And this Cherokee language system was also instrumental in the first Native American newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which was published first in February of 1828. As my business partner and best friend Silas loves to say, this is a great example of a call and response over time and space within both a graphic and a historical context. Here you have a poster work by Speakeasy Press consisting of a bilingual note about Sequoyah and the creation of the Cherokee script. You can see it uses large pieces of block type to give abstract form, and finally an unfinished line drawing of possibly Sequoyah himself. So then I also found a classic reference from a book illustration from the mid-1800s, just so you can see sort of how they sort of changed that between the two. I love how in the actual poster, though, the unfinished face is what leads the viewer to contemplate the unknowable visage of the creator, to honor them, but to also let the story shine more than the documented physical portrait. So then the cultural story dances or floats around them rather than directly on one certain gaze in the poster itself. So here you have a broadside or a posted bill that one might see outside of a local trading post or a saloon, or a wall that posted bills advertising for entertainment, news, wanted poster, lands for sale, and things like that during the expanding West. This was created by the United States War Department in 1888. In this detail, we have a map that is quite extensive and precise in its documentation of where Indigenous people are living or where they had been pushed or forced to live within a rigid man-made read Roman cartography. Notice how gold mines and military forts are also pointed out, drawing the eye to currents of extraction and war. So what I get personally angered about this is that if you actually read the big title at the bottom, every person of 21 years of age or over will be entitled to 160 acres. Cool, well, that's total bullshit, because that also means every white male person. So no one else is actually entitled. This is actually speaking to one section of people. This is probably one of the most well-known historical documents of the near completion of Manifest Destiny and its swarming West. This broadside advertises an upcoming land sale by the United States Department of the Interior in 1911. Take that into account, 1911. That's only 110 years ago. It's illustrated with a half portrait of Padani Kopini Snee, not afraid of Pawnee of the Yankton Indian tribe. So in terms of design, this poster sings by its use of numerous typefaces. Look at that. The organization is just fantastic in how much data, how clean and open it is. It's organized, it's very structured, but then it crushes the soul in its exploitation of Pandani Kopini Snee and the removal or the actual genocidal activity of those forcibly expelled from their natural homes. So now we've reached sort of like in my little historical through line, the boarding school period of Indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada, which started around the mid to late 1800s, 1850 to 1860, let's say. And this is a picture, a poster about the Haskell Native Indian University, which began as the U.S. Indian Industrial Training School. So it was one of the first Native American boarding schools established in 1884 to remove Native children from their families and assimilate them into Eurocentric culture. You can see here that we actually have the cutting of the braids, the short hair, the Western movement, but then you also have all these gravestones that show all the different Native tribes that were sort of like genocidally removed. And then you have a lot of sort of information on the green sort of growing other sort of grave sites that you have here as well. And so they're also trying to say that there is still celebration even amongst all of this death. I also love that you have this idea of braiding, and it reminds me of braiding sweet grass, which is a great book that I also would like to point out that anyone might want to read. So from there, we kind of jump into sort of like modern day. And here we have, I was at the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. with the Smithsonian. They had this show called Why We Serve. And it shows how Native Americans in the United States were actually very proud to serve in the armed forces. And so here we have 4 individuals that worked on this poster that has numerous posters inside of it. And then because of their service in the war, they could then use the GI Bill and go back to school. And so you also kind of see that there is pride to also still be a United States citizen and be an Indigenous person, but there's also a lot of complexity there because you have some tribes that don't actually honor the United States system. They consider their sovereignty to be pure. There are some that don't want to be recorded by the United States and the censuses. And so there's this different sort of understanding about how certain people want to be called Indigenous, First Nations, Native American, and Indian, where some people like all of those things and some people don't like any of them. So it's another paradox here. And so here at the bottom, you can also see this is still propaganda, but there's also still like these classic tropes that are being used of like poverty and harshness and the horse and the use of like the Pueblo adobe house here. And so, but these are things that people still do see and represent. And so it's a paradox, like you're trying to weigh things on both sides. So you also have to understand that with the finishing of World War II and the movement of the economy function is that we're then moving into sort of like popular culture and Americana. And so the rise of the middle class, the greater use of industry. And so you also have the expansion west. You have Hollywood and you have Los Angeles. And so here you have The Exiles, which is a movie that came out in 1961, directed by Kent McKenzie. And so McKenzie befriended a group of urban Native Americans and he chronicled their lives. All of them were non-actors and they drew from their own establishment in the Bunker Hill area of Los Angeles over one long alcohol lubricated night. It was actually added to the National Film Registry in 2009. And this is where I feel like a lot of the stuff is going to get a little more fun and playful, because this is where when you have the establishment of safety and security and money and possibility, you can also build these things out. And so here you have 4 different posters that were designed by the War Bonnet Enterprises, an all American Indian owned and operated company, which is based out of Los Angeles. And here you can see the Hopi calendar, the Natchez calendar, the Sioux calendar, and the Tlingit calendar. I really love these because of the use of the symbolism that comes with, you know, each tribe and the indigeneity behind it. I also love that they're using different colors. I really love the Natchez one where you can see that they're actually using lunar ideations versus solar. And so they're using a different form of like time and storytelling. I really appreciate that they're using symbology that also could have other sort of storytelling elements that if you also don't know what's going on, they're telling you something else, or someone that could actually decipher it could show you and walk you through it and tell a different story just by using the symbology, which I really appreciate. I love the use of like the colors. There's a great vibrancy to it. And to be honest, like this is 68. You are approaching the summer of love. You're approaching psychedelia. There's just something like really vibrant that then comes out, right? Like they're not these staid one color posters. There's a lot more life and vitality that sings out in these pieces. And so with that, we then are getting into the psychedelia, the use of like a rainbow color pole, and just, this is a light show, Institute of the American Indian Arts, and just a poster for Wild Seed. And I really was still trying to dig and find more pieces that come out of that. But the sad part is that during this time of the late 60s, a lot of Indigenous iconography is used as tropism. And so there are it's a really great Jefferson Airplane poster that I wanted to put in there, but I really wanted this to be about Indigenous posters made by Indigenous people or a lot of supporters. And so this is one of the only kind of late 1960s posters that I could find right now. That doesn't mean that I can't expand on this, but just there's only so much that we can do. So one key moment in Indigenous activism in the United States was the occupation of Alcatraz from November of 1969 to June of 1971. And it galvanized a new wave of Indigenous protest and sovereignty movements. So when they occupied it, they also then put up their proclamation to the White Great Father. And so this talks about what they were saying, why they occupied Alcatraz. I'm not going to dive into that as a lot of historical context here, but I consider this proclamation on a cowhide to be a poster. As with any historically and culturally nomadic people, how can one be expected to then perpetually transport a printing press with them? The joke that I have between Sadie Redwing and I is that, what are you supposed to do? Just hook up the press to the back of a horse on a sled as I move for the winter months, strapping drawers of type, lead, ink, and rolls of paper to my back? The privilege and expectation that posters are only made for or on paper needs to be obviously expanded. There is entitlement there. This modem method of putting it onto cowhide is also ingenious for its multi-purpose qualities, right? Declaring that sharing information this way is better than paper because it can withstand elemental exposure. You can use it as shade or shelter, and like woven blankets or tapestries, they can be wrapped around one as clothing. So not only you can use it as a storytelling method, but the language and the culture is literally enfolding, holding, and warming and teaching you all at the same time. I love paper as well, but paper cuts are horrible. And so here I just want to start showing works that came out of that celebration of what happened within the occupation of Alcatraz. And here you can see, Indian Joe Morris, and showing of different tribes around it, showing scenic views of course, the Golden Gate Bridge, the use of the sacred buffalo, and sort of like offering the pipe up to the buffalo to say that we are here and that we are still alive and we actually have made it through, let's say, Manifest Destiny and the expansion west. Same thing with this piece, it's very similar, but it's also like a one color. This one seems to be more done by a little bit of watercolor. And then I love the call and response that then happens 40 years later by Jesus Peraza here, showing that, there's different ways of using classic printing techniques, but also then pulling it into 40 years later, and that the struggle still is there and still has validity and historical reverence with it. So another influential moment of the protest was also the Wounded Knee occupation in February of '73. The occupation attracted wide media coverage. The event electrified Native Americans and made supporters travel to Wounded Knee to join the actual protest. At the time, there was a widespread public sympathy for the goals of the occupation, as Americans were becoming more aware of longstanding issues of injustice related to that of Indigenous people. Afterwards, the American Indian Movement, or AIM leaders, Dennis Banks and Russell Means, were indicted on charges related to the events, but in '74, their case was dismissed by a federal court. So these posters came out soon after documenting the actual protest. You may see the name of Akwesasne Notes here in the captions. I've used a few of them already. Akwesasne Notes was a newspaper published by the Monacan Nation at Akwesasne, whose lands are on both sides of the border between New York and Canada. The paper began in 1968 and was published somewhat irregularly between then and 1992. The paper was prolific in its poster making. I have 10 just in this presentation alone. I have found 10 to 20 more in the Library of Congress, and they would use these as ways to make money. We can print these really awesome posters, we can sell them for a fixed fee, we can mail them to people, but it also it perpetuates the system of poster making, right? It just allows messages to be mass marketed and sold, and also support greater need for a newspaper as well. But the Wounded Knee occupation really captured the attention of the United States then in 1973. But remember, in 73, we're in the throes of the Civil Rights Movement. The Vietnam War is still going. And of course, the Black Power movement. And so the Black Panther newspaper also showed solidarity here in supporting all of those that were held on federal charges. And so here are just two other posters that I really appreciate. One, it's like very hand-drawn. Everything is, two color. But then you also have sort of like the opposite here on the Standing with Wounded Knee done by the Legal Defense Office. It's more about when are we gathering, more sort of like upright type, but yet both sing in their own way, right? Like I love the one of actually just like the hand-drawn nature of that expressive type, but I'm sorry, like a well-organized chase with one color ink is also still great on the right. Like it just depends on like, what's the mood you're in today? How do you want to get that message out there? Some people really might be drawn to that on the left. Some people really might be drawn to that on the right.
Brian, we have a question. Would you like me to ask it now or would you like me to hold on?
Yeah.
So I have a question from Brian's #1 fan. Do you find in this process of excavation, the development or expectation of a pan-Indian/native culture that emerges from these works? Or is there more nuanced cultural representation than meets the eye?
I do not think I can speak at any way, shape, or form to answer that, but I think that's the beauty of the dichotomy of indigeneity, because I will make more references later on too to talk about like, I am talking from a very East Coast United States, like Western taught and trained education, where if someone were to do this and they were from Vancouver or South America or the Maori or anywhere from Australia or like the Pacific Islands, they're going to have a different viewpoint. Could there be certain things that are drawn through? Most certainly. Could I start to name them? That's a thesis for someone else to do. So I appreciate my #1 fan in asking that question, but of course, like you could find those through lines, right? Like if I want to go back to a music or the musical understanding of these things, you're going to have a bass note, right? And that note is going to then allow for other sort of melody to build off of it. And you still have those basses in the background going, right? Like they're still there with that. And so, yes, we could find those, but that would have to be part 2 of this conversation. So within the American Indian movement here, we have a display at the Wounded Knee Museum, and this was done by Lewis Hall. And this was, just painted on the wall, very hand done. You can see that there's sort of like the beginnings of a poster here or a beginning of a diorama, which then got turned into an actual printed lithograph. The Red Man's Great International Warrior Society, from the American Indian movement, pledged to fight the white man's injustice to Indians, his oppression, persecution, discrimination, and malfeasance in the handling of Indian affairs. No area in North America is too remote when troubles impend for Indians. AIM shall be there to help Native people regain human rights and achieve restitutions and restorations. I just want to note that there's the image of Lady Liberty, proud and protective, and also the stance of the warrior here on the left, facing east. And then do notice that the flags are hung upside down as a sign of distress. So a common theme that also runs through a lot of Akwesasne's posters is that there's the use of the singular striking image paired with moving and expressive typography along with brightly colored paper or a high contrast ink. For me, that is extremely smart design. Use what is available, be smart, be economical, be bold, be truthful, and represent reality. I just love this one on the far right as well. Like, why should an Indian woman have to bleach her hair to be accepted? Why should anyone have to change their visage to be accepted? Also, I love that she's smoking. I love that, there's this concept that like certain genders should or should not do certain things. And this is also the literal establishment of who they are. But when you also then look at that photograph, it's like, was that person also asked if they could take that picture? Did they agree? Did they know what it was going to turn into, right? So I say this in one direction, again, a paradox. It's very helpful. It's very real. But then you open up Pandora's box to say, were they exploited? Was it being misused? And so again, paradox on paradox on paradox. But I also love just the use of the imagery, the hand-drawn type. There are better ways to get this out there. And I feel like this is what Akwesasne Notes was trying to do. And so here you have the main sort of advertiser that I used for the talk tonight, which is a well-recognized individual here as Chief Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader who led his people during the years of resistance against the United States government policies of expansion. He was killed by the Indian Agency Police on Standing Rock Indian Reservation during an attempt to arrest him. As time passed, proven here by all of these posters, Sitting Bull has become a symbol and an archetype of an indigenous resistance movement. Obviously. This poster entitled Shrine to Hypocrisy is obviously that on US Mount Rushmore's National Monument, joined by Sitting Bull surveying the scene and rising over it. You can see that the Black Hills, where the monument was carved into the actual stone, were guaranteed to the Lakota people in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, as was the quotation by Old Joseph, Chief Joseph's father, that says the land was never sold to the United States. So for anyone that doesn't know, the Black Hills were a sacred space. The United States took them and carved 4 individuals that were presidents onto the actual the side of the mountain, like completely desiccating it to, I guess, build a monument to our own greatness. And so I do appreciate the not so subtle tongue-in-cheek of Sitting Bull rising behind it. In 1978, a peaceful transcontinental trek for Native American justice began with just a few hundred people departing Alcatraz Island in California and ended in Washington, D.C., accompanied by about 30,000 marchers. They were calling attention to the ongoing problems plaguing Indian communities, such as the lack of jobs, housing, healthcare, as well as dozens of pieces of legislation that was before Congress canceling treaty obligations of the U.S. government towards various Indian tribes. So I just do appreciate that, again, you have actual imagery of the people that are going through it, what they're saying, what they're chanting, what they're feeling. And it's the same thing here. It's like when you have to get out there and make a poster that says, show up, this is where we're going to be. Sometimes you have some planning, sometimes you don't, right? So you have the establishment of a sense of place, the landscape in the background, the individual, the use of color, the use of high contrast. I really love the one on the right, where it's just like really simple, cut it out, get the silk screen ready and just screen it and just like, you know, chuck and go. But I also really love these here because you have like uses of things that could be considered to be tropism, the buffalo, the use of the indigeneity, but also the skull. But then there's something sort of not playful, but like it does know, it's self-referential. It does know what it's trying to say, or just the direct use of type. I love this this piece for the benefit because you also have this idea of a sun, you have pathways, you have a moving of rays of shining light onto something, you have the individuals moving forward, but then you also have sort of like the second longest walk, which happened in 2008, and that's pairing that circle with a medicine wheel and showing how that is also then moving forward, that the walk and the struggle continues to this day, but also then the dropping in of yellow and having a little more, let's say, hope if you're going to align a color to that. By 78, there is still not a declaration of sort of like Native peoples and their rights in the United States. And so I just wanted to show that this is, you know, again, you have the use of the circle, you have the use of the medicine wheel. I do appreciate that this is another tongue-in-cheek of the use of sort of like the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty well organized, but do know that that one little widow kind of annoys me at all times. It's like someone should have caught that. But then comes one of my favorite pieces in the whole work that I'm going to show you. Behold, they are dancing. There's something about this that just has a sense of dance, of pleasure, of radiation, of brilliance, the use of the iconography, the geographic forms, but there's just so much play, and you can feel the light and the wind and the soaring, and it just, I love it. It's also anonymous, and you can sort of take out from whatever, you know, you want to from it, that it says, behold, they are dancing. The sacred nation of the West is dancing. The day of the sun shall bring them strength, an eagle for the eagle nation. There is just something beautiful about this that even if it's, of all the things that I would love to find, I would just love to find this actual poster. And then we can think about culture in terms of how do you make the things that make the things do, right? Like posters can be used as educational. And so here we have these Navajo die charts that around like the 1980s that show, you know, these are the actual objects that help dye the the textile to then sort of like weave it together. So you can see like the wild blackberries, you can see the red onion skins, and then what that actually turns into in the textile itself. So the Navajo dye chart was created by the late Mabel Burnside Myers of Pine Springs, Arizona, back in the 1950s. Her daughter, Isabel Myers DeShinney, continues the artwork and teaches weaving and dyeing as the Navajo weaving instructor at the University of New Mexico in Gallup. Here we have Isabel Myers DeShinney's framed chart, which took Best of Show at the Navajo Nation Fine Art Fair in 2019. It is a framed 3 by 6 feet work, which features 87 different colors, meticulously labeled with its corresponding color agents, and at its heart is an exquisite little miniature rug. That, to me, is a poster. I couldn't not talk about queerness and that of life itself. I am a queer man. I am married. I am proudly married and out. But we can't talk about these things without talking about AIDS and AIDS representation. And so here we have a piece that was illustrated by Donald Montalou, Yellowbird. And I wanted and tried to reach out to him to see, though he illustrated many of these posters, I'm going to show you some more, I did want to know, did he have any involvement in how it was written, how things are shown, the use of color, just to get a little more of sort of like the design understanding. But grandfather, you are wise in the old ways. Give us wisdom about AIDS. There is something to be said about transmitting understanding of, like, when you go through the smallpox epidemic, like when you go through cholera, other things that have affected Indigenous peoples, there is something to be said about, you know, you are wise, help us with this wisdom. But the thing about AIDS is that it had not sort of like been known at that time when it was decimated, not only the queer community, but other, you know, people of color in the United States at the time. And so you can see, you know, our ancestors didn't see AIDS in our future, and so prevent it now, but also keep AIDS out of our tradition. It's a little egotistical to say that your tradition can be, something can be kept out of it, right? I really appreciate that you have these women in a sense of shame turning away from the viewer, but also women were very much underrepresented in the late 80s and early 90s because the CDC refused to acknowledge that women actually got AIDS and they could prove that they had it. And so that was also a big fight that ACT UP was also speaking out against. And so I then realized that, and I appreciate that at the end here on the right, that you do have a little girl that's talking about, you know, help me with my questions about AIDS, understanding that the knowledge does need to be passed on. I really like the work of Heap of Birds. His work focuses on stereotyping and appropriation of Indigenous culture in American society through word-based art. He seeks to eradicate racist and romantic concept of Native Americans and reveal the more complex realities of contemporary Indigenous experience. You can see that here by the use of the birds, the use of words. You know, we do not want Indians and their names, mascots. You know, they're living people. Like, see us as beings, please. And here you can see that there are these monoprints, just very like quick and fast, and get them out there, but then talk about this. There's a story behind this, like something is going on, you know, about that which you take away. Well, about what? It's a fragment, right? Well, that's the point. And that you be able to get that far, you know, some people can and cannot understand these things. But here I do have a trigger warning. Sadly, we hear about the term active shooter commonly in our daily lives now. Here, Heap of Birds uses the phrase to reference the massacres committed by the United States troops, read Custer, against Indigenous people in the 1800s westward expansion. The prints on the right are considered ghost prints. Those that are, you know, after you make one print, you then peel it off, you put it again, you swipe it, you pull it off again. So it's the residual sort of ink that's still on the plate when you do a monoprint. Heap of Birds says that these prints recall the ghosts of the whole culture. So that into the 1990s, we're now up to the time where Native tribes are actually being asked to join the census, to sign up, to have your voice heard. But at the same time, that's the dichotomy and the problem, right? You have some people that are like, I do not want the United States government to count me. I don't actually represent or acknowledge their sovereignty. But then at the same time, the federal government realizes their problem. They want to help fix it. They have federal funds that can then go to tribes and reservations. And so what do you do with that dichotomy? And so here we have 2 Census Bureau posters just saying that to please vote and get your voice heard by registering with the census. So Indigenous sovereignty was also not recognized by the United Nations until 2007. So here you can see that the United Nations Declaration of the Rights on Indigenous People delineates and defines the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including their ownership rights to cultural and ceremonial expression, identity, language, employment, health, education, and other issues. Their ownership also extends to the protection of their intellectual and cultural property. It was a non-binding resolution, and it did pass with 4 opposing votes. Can you guess who they were? That's right, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course, the United States. I truly and absolutely love this piece by Ryan Redcorn. The use of just that wonderful golden yellow, the playfulness, the symmetry, the sacred geometry. You literally can look at this dancing piece as it just stands right in front of you, even though it is a stagnant print. There's just something so enlivening about this. This was commissioned by the National Museum of the American Indian Office for the External Affairs for their 20th anniversary gala. I just really loved this. I was glad that it's in the National American Museum. You can see it, you can find it online to read more about it. I love that within this, you also have this push for indigeneity to also still very much show up and say, we are still here. So you have a picture here of the Seneca Iroquois National Museum of the Indians of the Archive Department in 2014 saying, you know, we are still here. We do play lacrosse. This was an Indigenous game. We have all of these, you know, kids dressed up in the regalia to say, you know, that we are still here. We are showing up. We still play these games, understand where they come from. And from that, I then want to look at sort of like Melanie Cervantes's work, because yes, the John Paul, George, and Ringo trope is real, but it's also extremely well designed. Like exist and resist and indigenize and decolonize. Like these messages have not given up. Like this is the voice that is now coming out in, you know, the late aughts. And so it's just like, pay attention, please show up. And she also teams up with Jesus Barraza here to then talk about this indigenous resistance that's coming out to protect our environment, especially from Central America. And I just, again, I love the use of the actual imagery, the bright and brilliant colors, the use of a sense of place. You'll see that these themes keep ringing through. So to my number one fan in the audience, yes, there are these things of a sense of place, a sense of culture, a sense of caretaking, like they do exist. Like you will see the bell and the note keep ringing. And so here you have, you know, of course, you have the access, the Dakota Access Pipeline and sort of us transmitting and going through all of those issues. And you have, you know, the water is life and that entire movement to say that these are things that we need to pay attention and sort of stand up for. We have to understand that our world is being actively fight to be destroyed. And so we have to say that water is life. We cannot just stand by. And then I love that, again, print this stuff on fabric where it can withstand the elements. So these activists and protesters are, you know, on the left are protesting against the replacing of the Line 3 pipeline. And you can see actually the same poster being used outside the White House. I have to thank Silas Munro for finding this wonderful piece by Amos Paul Kennedy that he found at Letterform Archive, because nothing really thumbs it to turning up the understanding of it is not top down, it is bottom up, to then take wonderful sans serif type and just literally lay it on you in black ink that this is sovereign, and just to like really thumb it right to your face. I had the chance to chat with Anna Soularkis, who is Navajo, Greek, and Crete, and then her work about these large billboards that are also dimensions are variable, just kind of going into like, it's great that you still acknowledge that Native Americans are still here. The ability not only with sort of posters being more of a smaller context, billboards and those are able to be seen from miles away to sort of get the message out there. And there's also like, yes, it's educational, but there's some sass to this. Like there's some cutting, bitter, like middle finger straight through you sort of understanding here that, I'm sorry, I am a very bitter and grouchy person sometimes, but these to me, I see them and I love it and I laugh. And I'm just like, I really like the way you respect Native American rights, right? It depends on the day, your attitude, your mood, how you come at it. But to have this just be right out there, just giving it to the people of Colorado, I really appreciated those.
Brian, on that note, we do have a question along similar lines from Sarah Wang, who asks, can you talk more on Indigenous humor and design, especially design that may resist interpretation from people outside of the community, design that may purposefully obfuscate in order to protect sacred ideas and messages?
I don't know if I know enough to answer that question. I truly don't. You could say the same thing with queerness too, right? It's like, is there sometimes a language that is created within a community that the community is talking to the community? Yes. And at the same time, that's also a protective way to hold and establish a known language that also can sort of exist and have sovereignty within itself. I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. But I feel like the pieces that you show here would just straight up text have that quality, right? It doesn't reveal anything. It's sort of approachable and accessible to everyone that it hides and secures and protects the people that it's speaking for.
Correct. And it also doesn't use color. It uses nothing that has sort of the hanging vestiges of tropism, or it comes with extra baggage, right? It is pure message.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then we have one more question from Ariel Pershman, who says, are there any modern examples that you have for Ho-Chunk graphic design? Not talking Angela Decora.
I do not know. Not in this, no. But please document that for me, Maya, so I can read more about it too, please.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I have so many more slides to get through. I have about 20, so we're going to whiz very quickly so we can still save some good time for some open Q&A, and I can drop into the chat as well. But again, when I mentioned how a lot of things that were using the psychedelia of the late 60s, these pieces by Johnny Daikon, even though it says 2019, I probably think they were made a little bit before. I think this was also shown and reprinted for a museum and another show. And so I really think that this is where I think there are more things about archives that need to be unearthed, talked about, reprinted, and sort of like taken care of, that there are things still missing within the timeline. And so I love that people are asking me these hard questions. I have no problem saying I don't know the answer to these things. Like, I am just unearthing this. As Maya, when you and I talked a long time ago, when you asked me to do this, I was like, I only know a couple things, and I've then started to learn more and more and more. And so the ripple has started. And so I will also mention that towards the end, that we are going to need more help to do this. So based in Michigan is Dylan A.T. Miner. He's an American artist, activist, art historian, and educator who also focuses on Indigenous and anti-colonial issues. He is a prolific poster maker. Look this individual up. I am in awe of the amount of work that he produces. I just love that he's using iconography of, the skull and crossbones, very much a Western take on, like the tombstone, but also asking that we honor those ancestors and protect the land and worship the water. I love that he's talking about the solstice today, and every day we honor the sun, the moon, the land, and the struggle. This means a lot to me. I really agree with what he has to be saying here. I also appreciate his use of color, the image, the bilingual. I love that he's also using prehistorical objects and clay to also help tell a story about legacy and long-term history of expression and objectivity and in cultural form. It might seem trite, but TV is still a really great storyteller. Here we have a scene from Reservation Dogs. It's the first season, episode 8, where Spirit, played by Dallas Goldtooth, is waking up Bear, played DeFaro Winatai. And notice the posters on the walls. This is a way of showing that all of us not only accessible and affordable art, but also support its message and its beauty, right? You think about, like, I want to have this on my wall to remind me it's okay. You're going to do great. This is awesome. This is who you are. This is where you come to. And I just love that you can still see these used in common vernacular of television. And that's why I love Stephen Paul Judd's work, and just using, again, simple colors. I loved America before it was called America, and then just an image that he said, this is how I also want to portray it. And then, does American exceptionalism include honoring the treaties? Again, it's a blatant question to give it to you with just the image of the person just standing there saying, can you please answer this question? I don't actually know what year these were made or what the dimensions were, but I'm still trying to work on that. So this is still a living and breathing document for me as well. Here you have the Radical Indigenous Survivance and Empowerment, or RISE movement. I love what Brian's work is doing here to use three-dimensionality to sort of build space within a poster. The geometric patterns and that sense of play tied together really well with both the message and sort of like the movement. There's just something like I want to get in there on like a small little like glider and see what this space actually consists of. And I also really appreciate these other people in the Indigenous Design Collab using, again, bright colors, geometric form, playfulness, a sense of sacred geometry. You can also start to see these are the notes that kind of play through at least what I'm looking at. I also really love this idea of teaching through identification. Mesquite is a common name for several plants of the genus Prosopis, which contains 40 species of a small leguminous tree. If you need to eat something, teach people how to find food, how to understand how to take care of themselves. It's not always about going to the Western understanding of a supermarket. And so there's something still to be said about identification, teaching through just something as simple as showing what a beautiful tree looks like with a simple one color. There's also the spiritual aspect we haven't talked about yet. As many of my friends and acquaintances know, I'm a deeply spiritual person. And so Leo Vicenti's tongue-in-cheek reference here that the domestic spiritual animal can be slaughtered, bought, and sold as a food commodity is not lost on me. I love, again, the handwritten lettering. It looks like you're going to a grocery store. It's like, buy this now. I mean, it's using all the same things that sort of Western design has told us about marketing and capitalism. And then again, just sort of like giving you the middle finger right back at it. I really love Jeffrey Gibson's work. The piece on the left here is an actual, it's a made object. There's, acrylic on canvas, there's glass beads. It has a reference to type, let me be who you need me to be. And then the spirits are laughing, which is a digital graphic that was just used outside of one of the pieces that he was working on. But there's, again, the sacred geometry, the bright use of color, patterning. I truly love these. And there's also the sense of the rave community. There's a sense of that coming out of sort of, again, dancing, getting into the body, letting things be free, letting the movement and sort of the joie de vivre of life come out, that I know that Jeffrey's work is really based around. And so here, I really love that I can show something that is also a literal poster mastaba pyramid that he built with a group of people. And so here you can see, respect indigenous land and how these multicolored, very bright neon posters are actually posted onto the mastaba itself. The installation was adorned with these phrases advocating for indigenous space and culture, and they're wheat pasted. It was co-created by Gibson with Eric Paul Reed, Luzianne Hill, and Dana Claxton. And you can't go through all of this without finding something that actually is of the now and talks about COVID. So I really appreciate Crystal's work here, stay home and save our people, to really get into, even in the midst of a worldwide challenge, and try and get to people to pay attention and to care with humanity. I love the use of color, dimensionality, gradient, storytelling with both the text and the totem, but also the sense of literal place and the space behind it. It's not all doom and gloom, right? There is more color, and sort of it still shines within our vision to move forward into the future as well. But there is still a rallying cry. There is so much more work to be done. Archives need the dedicated research and conservation to keep up this work, as Poster House is doing, but we need more of this. I've only shown a very small bit here through my East Coast reconnected Western design canon educated viewpoint. So there also needs to be more focus on South America, the Hawaiian and Pacific nations, the Maori, and Australia. So there's a lot more work to be done. I do have some resources that I would love to share. These are some publications that are really important and have been important to me. Decolonizing Design, which is about to come out by Dory Tunstall. I cannot sing and strive for enough. Polymode was lucky enough to help design the actual insides of the publication. And of course, the Library of Congress, Just Seeds Artist Cooperative. I got a lot of stuff on there, so please check them out. An Indigenous Design Collab is also awesome. And then I want to end this by this piece by William Estrada and Dr. Patricia Nguyen, calling for us to protect Native, Black, Asian American, Latin, Caribbean immigrants and refugee communities. I hope that these posters I've shared over the last hour have been enlightening, joyous, and informative in their melody and song. And thank you for your time and attention. Special thanks to all these wonderful individuals that I list here. You're really awesome to me. Thank you. And thanks for listening.
Brian, that was incredibly thorough and gorgeously curated. I also have to ask you about the typeface that you're using, because
yeah. So this typeface is called Maria of Los Angeles, or MOLA.
okay.
Silas, what is the designer's name? I am blanking. Roberto Rodriguez. He based it on a flag that was used during the Spanish-American War, I think, and it was hand done. And there are these, like, you can see, like, yeah, like the finials and like the things that are in the serifs, and we have loved that. And I felt like this was just something else designed by an Indigenous person. I'm like, I have to bring this out, and it was it's
really beautiful. I feel like it brought that extra to your presentation. Silas actually wants to say this. I know he's sitting right next to you, but one of the threads that I noticed in your abundant, deep, and varied talk was this tension between visibility and exploitation. Do you have suggestions for continued study, especially from allies, on how we can learn more and avoid being extractive in the process?
Okay, so yes. I would go in the direction of find out what those tropes are. And I would say, find out the things that are showing, the things that should not be shown in that way. I actually would say, go to the Native American Museum in the Smithsonian right now. They have an entire exhibition on all the things that have been used in terms of incorrect understandings of Indigenous people. This is how they were used in marketing. This is how they're used on television. It's always like the Western, when you fight cowboys and Indians, it's like, who's going to be the cowboy and who's going to be the Indian? The Indians die. Yeah. That's a trope. It's reality because the cowboy showed up and killed all the Indians, but like, it's things like that where the best way to learn is just to literally read more, understand, find out like what are those images that are used incorrectly, and then stop using them, or find ways to reappropriate them. Like, I feel like all these posters have been that I've shown where it's just like, I'm going to give it back to you. I'm going to give it back to you. I'm going to give it back to you in a way that's, uses sarcasm, disarmament, like humor, tongue in cheek, but at the same time, you have some that are like, water is life, stop polluting our rivers, right? Like, there's such a dichotomy there too.
So I actually have a question for you. And this is kind of goes back and reaches into my culture as well, because I wanted to ask about the names that have been given to Indigenous people and how perhaps we've landed on Indigenous peoples being an appropriate term for, this group of people.
Colonialism. Let's start there, right? There's a dude, his name was Columbus, hopped in a ship, a lot of the historical things, landed here. He thought it was the Indies, right? So we call it Indians. For me, indigeneity and indigenousness, it's like when I said, like, I am someone that will always bring up where I'm from, because that is the sense from which that I grew out, right? It's almost Whitman and like Whitmansonian, right? It's like, this is the energy that came out of me. And so I look at it as like the Indigenous, the people from that area, they have always been here. I guess that's why I feel like the indigeneity or Indigenous is a word where you can use, but also in a modern context, what about people that also then go back into migration and migratory? And like, like when I showed that last poster, it's like, we also still have to support and defend those people that are migrants, that are that are immigrants, that are moving between any 2 or 3 countries, right? Like, it just, capitalism sucks. Capitalism is what caused this, the extraction of things. That's why, Columbus is like, cool, let's find a way to get more spices and gold, right? Like, it's literally, so it's like at least the Indigenous word gives you something that is not pointing a finger straight at Native Americans, right? Like that's at least where I would say for now, that's the term, but it probably will shift again, right? When we talk about sort of like racism in America, the words that have been used against African Americans and Black people has changed and evolved over time. And so it's the same thing with saying some people will use Native American and Indigenous interchangeably. I'm not bothered by that, but some people are. Which is why you have to at least hold enough space to say, is this what you want to be called? It's like saying, like, you know, my pronouns are he, him. It also acknowledges that I acknowledge people that want to go by a different pronoun. So if you at least ask someone, what is your heritage? How do you want me to term this? And then at least have a little humanity too. Like, where's our humanity gone? Where we can actually try to lean in and ask these questions to each other.
Yeah. So to follow up on that, so it's my understanding of the historical context of Columbus coming to the Americas and then calling it the Indies was a mistake, correct? Because he thought it was India and it wasn't. And the way that has been relayed to me as an Indian growing up, right? Because I grew up in India, was like, this was a horrific mistake, like, when we weren't happy with that mistake. And the reason why I'm asking you this is because we have a poster in the Air India exhibition of, have you seen it?
Which I just walked through and I took a picture of it and I was like, we have some problems here.
Exactly. And it's like brown on brown action, or like, you know, marginalized versus marginalized action. And I always call that poster out because it makes me uncomfortable. But at the same time, it's like neither cultures is to blame. It's the colonizer, right? But I never, like, as a South Asian woman, like, I know I know the issues. I understand where it's coming at. Okay. I'll tell us what. Yeah. So the poster is like, it's illustrated. There are two hills and one sits higher than the other. There is the Maharaja, who's clearly Indian, wearing his turban, who is a stereotype on his own. And he's using a cloth to sort of make smoke signals. And he seems really quite experienced and, you know, he seems like he's an expert at it. And then on the opposite side, on the lower hill, there seems to be an Indigenous person wearing a feathered headdress, using a pipe that doesn't seem to work. And he's kind of in awe of, or like shocked that the Maharaja is capable of, you know, making these incredible smoke signals. And the whole messaging of the poster is to say smoking is bad for health, sponsored by the Cigarette Association.
Which then gets even worse because he's not smoking a cigarette, he's holding a pipe, and the pipe usage in Indigenous experience isn't actually a holy thing. And like, it's very important to be able to use the sacred plant to get into a sacred headspace to honor like the Great Spirit. And so you also have, you can't blame necessarily like Indian people. You have to blame marketing. You have to blame capitalism that has to go through the machinations of a human being that has to make the advertisement to then sell something. It's the action of capitalism that's causing this to happen. And so like that, and yeah, right, sorry, it's a PSA, right? And so it's like
a PSA. Yeah.
And so it's like saying don't smoke, but then don't use a sacred tradition to tell someone not to smoke. Maybe you should use a picture of like a Hollywood show person, like, you know, smoking on the silver screen. I'm sorry, like that's the issue right there. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when I walked through it, like I saw it and I was like, oh, we got problems here.
Yeah.
But you can't get rid of that because you have to use it as a teaching moment. That's why you still have to put those things up. You can't just sort of like you can't erase the things that are bad, right? You still have to show the tropes to educate how not to do the tropes.
Right. It's so the funny thing here about that poster is also India is a secular country with plurality of religion, but the major religion being Hinduism also, like, there is a history of smoking and burning marijuana to sort of get it to a higher level of consciousness and understanding of the divine. So that in itself is hypocritical. But what I want to kind of discuss with you, I know we're like well over time, but but I do want to get to this point is because you and I have an understanding of the problematic nature of that poster, right? Because you have your understanding from the mining that you've done of your own background, and I have mine because I grew up in India. But a lot of the times I notice when we walk past that poster, no one has anything to say. So I'm wondering, how has that, I guess that colonized mistake of misnaming Indigenous people as Indian sort of internalized in this part of the world and in Indigenous culture?
Blanket statement, it's erasure. Erasure has done this because it's not known, it's not seen, it's not talked about.
Yeah.
It's erasure. It's the fact that it's one of the first things that I showed within the 34 years that they took that watercolor of the Indigenous person and then made that map. There was a difference because it was whitewashed. So I would at least say it's education is the issue. It's not taught because it's not important. It's not seen as important. It's not white. It's not Western, right? And so like, that is the thing that I think, at least for me, it's like, it's all about education and the ability to want to teach it, right? Because some people are just like, well, Indians don't matter. Native American people don't matter. They're gone. And people still to this day think that they're just like, this is our land. I'm like, are you kidding me? It was stolen. But it's how they are taught, it is how they conceptualize space and where they were born and where they came from, right? And do they even have the awareness to then think more broadly? So sure, people will walk by it and they won't be triggered by it. You have to be taught to understand the triggers and the tropisms, right? Like that takes time, effort, love, care, and humanity, right?
Yeah.
But you can't get those things when we're worried about the clock and timing of things to do. So maybe that's a good place for us to stop.
Yeah. But thank you for such a robust conversation on a culture that has been erased, as you said. So the mining and the research that you've done is just phenomenal to bring us this kind of information. And I'm so grateful to you for having done that. So again, thank you so much. And I hope that we can do part 2 of this.
I feel like it needs to be done. Like there's so much more work to do. I would love to do it. I feel like it needs to be broken into smaller sections because I had to whiz through this. So I apologize.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone that also needs more time to process, I can speak very quickly. So thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Can't wait to be back.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have other programs that also bring you different sort of ideas of design in different canons, not just the Western canon. So please join us. Well, Western in the sense that we know it as white. So please do join us. And thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.